And welcome. I'd like to introduce Cleo Pascal, the non-resident senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense for Democracies, who will be presenting today, looking at the broader Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, who is joining us today from the region. And so we are getting a very first-hand account in this discussion. Cleo, I'll let you further introduce yourself, tell people where you're at, and jump right in.
Thank you very much. This is, given the people in the room, this is feeling a little bit like a thesis defense. So if I fail, you can blame Mike. I am currently in Koror in the Republic of Palau, which is coincidentally or not the place I'm going to try to make the case for being America's geographical pivot of history. So that's a little bit what the presentation is about how the heartland theory may have made sense for others, but it never really made sense for the U.S. Everybody on this call knows this map, which made sense for the British at the time, at least in part because the other side of that pivot area was the British Empire as well, with India. But I don't think it really made sense from a U.S. perspective. It's a very important conceptualization, but it was never, what happened in that region was never as important to the U.S., I would argue, and I'm happy to argue afterwards later on, as the Pacific. And we can see it in the actual map of the extremities of the U.S., which were put together over centuries to show what is the heartland of the U.S. So this map shows the northernmost part of the U.S. in Alaska, the southernmost part of the U.S. in American Samoa, the easternmost part of the U.S. in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the westernmost, ignoring the date line, part of the U.S. in the Northern Marianas and Guam. And you can see that there is this big chunk of the Pacific that is at the heart of the U.S., and it was absolutely not accidental. The U.S. pieced this map together over the centuries, and we're going to quickly go through how and then why, and how others, including now the Chinese, understand this very well and are trying to hit at the heartland. So the U.S. Was involved in the Pacific even before it had a proper Pacific coast. And that manifest destiny, and this is again a bit daunting because I know there are a lot of historians in the room, so I'm looking forward to you correcting me later, but manifest destiny moved its way along to the west, with California being admitted as a state in 1850, the Alaska Purchase in 1867, the Transcontinental Railway in 1869. But already in 1838 to 1842, the U.S. had launched an exploring expedition into the Pacific. The treaty had been signed with the Qing Dynasty. The Treaty of Kanagawa was getting signed with Japan. The refute coaling stations in Pango Pango were being established. This Pacific footprint was starting to be put together at the same time as the dominant powers in the Pacific were the Europeans. And it's worth remembering then, if you were sitting in the U.S., economic expansion east was difficult because Europe was full. Europe was full and expanding around the globe the other way. So the place that you would have room to move is if you moved west, you would hit the Europeans, but it wouldn't be as necessarily entrenched as it was if you would move east. And of course, south for the U.S. became very important as well. So you have, here, let's see if I can get this. Yeah. So you had a whole series of actions being taken by the U.S. to consolidate its position, including the Guano Act of 1856, which stated one of my favorite pieces of U.S. legislation, which say that whenever any citizen of the United States discovers a deposit of guano on any island, rock, or key not within the lawful jurisdiction of any other government and not occupied by the citizens of any other government, and takes peaceable possession thereof and occupies the same, such island, rock, or key may, at the discretion of the president, be considered as appertaining to the United States. And this is where several key pieces of the United States, including Midway, for example, appertained to the United States. Okay. The big move, of course, was the Spanish-American War. And President McKinley at the time had a very serious problem because the Spanish were the dominant power in that part of the world, and the U.S. did not have a port in the Western Pacific. So as the war broke out in the Caribbean and the U.S. was being kicked out of ports in Asia, specifically Hong Kong, because of port neutrality, he was faced with this problem. And as he described it, when the Spanish War broke out, Dewey was at Hong Kong, and I ordered him to go to Manila to capture or destroy the Spanish fleet. And he had to, because if defeated, he had no place to refit on that side of the globe. And if the Dons, the Spanish, were victorious, they would likely cross the Pacific and ravage our Oregon and California coasts. This is very important because this is the first time that I found that a president of the United States makes a very clear statement that if there's a hostile expansionist power in the Western Pacific, the mainland of the U.S. isn't safe. Unfortunately, he says, and so he had to destroy the Spanish fleet, and he did it, but that was as far as I thought then. And that's kind of very clear in what happened with the kind of haphazard follow-up in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines was seen presented as a liberation from the Spanish. It was also seen, as most of these things are, as a stepping stone to the China market. It was very contentious domestically, and it began this issue of the U.S. How can the U.S. create its security zone in the Central and Western Pacific without becoming a colonial power? People like Mark Twain were very against the taking of the Philippines, and it was something that only became resolved later on, and we'll get to how. So that same year, there was also the annexation of Hawaii. There had been concerns, very similar concerns, as far back as 1849, when the French sacked Honolulu, that if a hostile expansionist foreign power set up in that region, the U.S. wouldn't be safe. U.S. mainland wouldn't be safe. So, and we were getting cables from quite early on, 1871, for example, note from the U.S. minister to Hawaii back to the Department of State, because remember, it was a foreign country then. Is it probable that any European power who may hereafter be at war with the United States will refrain from taking possession of this weak kingdom in view of the great injury that could be done to our commerce through their acquisition of them? So again, an acknowledgement that what is in the Western or Central Pacific isn't going to stay there. Hawaii was annexed. So over the course of that period, the U.S. grew and grew and grew. And the perception was that as it expanded, everybody wanted to cut a deal with Uncle Sam. And this is very much the expansion to the Pacific. You can see the fattest Uncle Sam has the ship under his arm, was a key component of that understanding. So what do? You need to build the Panama Canal. In this graphic, it was still the Nicaraguan Canal, but again, it was that, okay, we've got to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific so that we can move out into the Pacific and consolidate the trade and security zone. The next big move was the Great White Fleet, which was very much a manifestation and a determination to show that the US was here to stay. And if you read the quotes from President Roosevelt, he was very clear about the intent. In my own judgment, the most important service that I rendered to peace was the voyage of the battle fleet around the world. I'd become convinced that for many reasons, it was essential that we should have it clearly understood by our own people, especially, but also by other peoples, that the Pacific was as much our home waters as the Atlantic. And there are a lot of echoes. When you go through this history, you keep hearing things that sound familiar. And one of them was that there was a concern that this would prompt Japan into attack. You don't want to offend the Japanese. You don't want to, and what Roosevelt said was, I believe that the Japanese would feel as friendly in this matter as we did, but that if my expectation had proven mistaken, it would have been proof positive that we were going to be attacked anyhow. So what you ended up with, just to go back to this, was you had this route of the Great White Fleet that went through 10 years ago, acquired Hawaii, showed off in Auckland in Australia, showed up in the new territories of Philippines and Guam, showed up in Japan. And here we are. What happened was the Spanish lost the rest of their possessions in World War I to the Germans, and the Germans lost those possessions to the Japanese in World War I. So you end up with this map. This is the 1921 map of the Pacific, where you have the Philippines and Guam on the left side, you have Hawaii on the right side, and you have the Japanese mandate, which includes what's now the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, Palau, where I am now, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, right in the center of the Pacific. This is a zone that's about 80% the size of the continental United States, and cuts the U.S. off from the markets and from the sea lines of China and of the rest of the U.S. So the strategy that had been put in place to try to make sure that an aggressive expansionist power wouldn't be able to hit the U.S. failed, because the center of the Pacific ended up going to Japan under this League of Nations mandate. And where I am now, Palau, was the civilian headquarters for the Japanese mandate. And it's a Japanese graph, but it gives an idea of the relative population sizes. And here in that that's Guam cutting into it, but here on the main island in Palau, there were about 6-to-1 Japanese to Palauans, and this was very much of a civilian endeavor, at least initially. A lot of intermarriage schools were set up, clinics, businesses. This was meant to be a permanent part of Japan. The Tinian, which is now part of the United States, looked like a little Japanese village. And you saw this replicated across the entire region. A lot of agriculture and various forms of commerce that would trade back into Japan. It was closed to the outside. This is also the place where, if you know your sort of 1920s and 1930s history, you had sort of some very famous kind of undercover expeditions from Americans trying to figure out what was going on here on the ground. This is where Pete Ellis died, for example. It was closed. And it was mostly civilian, but especially after Japan left the League of Nations, it started to militarize. And you end up in war. This whole center of the Pacific was such a well-defended area. The U.S. had to go down and then come up through the Solomons, and then at least part of it over to Tarawa and then fight its way across while the other part came around the other side. Not far from this island is the island of Peleliu, where you had one of the most horrific battles of the war. The U.S. Finally won, and the end result was that entire Japanese mandate became the trust territory of the Pacific Islands under the UN Security Council. And if anybody's interested, we can talk about why it was at the UN Security Council, which is very unusual. But administered by the US, initially by the Navy, with a lot of very odd things going on. The Northern Mariana Islands was closed, and Saipan was used for CIA training operations, including with the Taiwanese that were supposed to be dropped behind enemy lines. 67 nuclear tests were done in the Marshall Islands. It was pretty peculiar here for a long time. And for the locals, they went from kind of doing jumping jacks for the Japanese to doing jumping jacks for the US military. Now, I mentioned that the idea that the US is actually not a comfortable colonizer. And they had a problem, which is vast strategic area in the center of the Pacific that has been proven to be the geographical pivot of history for the US. Can't allow a hostile foreign power to set up here anymore, but you also don't want to be a colonist. So what do? What the US did was very unique. They set up a Congress of Micronesia where delegates came from across the region to Saipan to decide their own future for the region. Initially, the US offered the entire region to become part of the United States. Many people in the region had kind of had enough of colonization by then. So what you ended up with was a series of presidents and vice presidents who had served in the Pacific, most during World War II, who had lost friends on the beaches of the Pacific, and who were determined to find a new solution that would give the US the security it needed, but in a context that was consistent with America's perception of its own values. It is important to understand how big the Pacific loomed in the minds of presidents and vice presidents all the way through. President Bush Sr. was a fighter pilot in the Southern Pacific, and he was very close with a lot of the Pacific Island leaders. So what ended up happening was the countries of Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia were born. They decided to go independent, but they signed this completely unique agreement with the US called the Compacts of Free Association, in which the government of the United States has authority and responsibility for security and defense matters in or related to the three countries. The US has no other agreements like this with any other countries. These are, if anybody asks you who the closest allies of the US are, it's Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia. They've put their lives in the hands of the US. But it's even more complicated than that. So they're also called freely associated states. Compact COFA countries, Compacts of Free Association countries, and freely associated states is the same thing. Same term, different terms for the same thing. The people of these three countries, independent countries, can freely live and work in the US. They can get off, a Palauan can get off a plane in Oregon and get a job that same day. They can and do, at very high rates, serve in the US military. The postal system is domestic US mail, which means that they can order off of Amazon. This young boy is a boy that I met on one of the outer islands in the state of Yap in the Federated States of Micronesia. He is holding those books because he signed up for Dolly Parton's Imagination Library, which sends free books to kids, any kid who wants them from age 0 to 5 in the US to help promote literacy. And because YAP is part of a freely associated state and is domestic mail, about 85% of the kids in YAP under 5 are signed up for Dolly Parton's Imagination Library. They've synchronized their school systems to the US systems. They can study at US universities at in-state rates. Their appliances use US voltage. They aren't members of the Commonwealth. They use American spelling. They drive on the right. They have access to US weather services, Federal Aviation Administration, other government services. And their relationship with the US is under the Department of Interior primarily. State is there, but they're actually mainly administered under Interior. There is nothing else like this between the US and any other countries. And this is because of how strategically important the location is and how that was acknowledged by a whole generation of leaders who were in very high positions afterwards. The result is, if you're looking at a strategic map of the region now, everything here in dark blue is part of the United States of America outright. So the Mandate area, which became the Trust Territory area, 3 of them, Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, went independent, signed the compacts. The Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, where Saipan is, just joined the US outright. And so you've got this secure block in the middle, in the center of the Pacific. The geographical pivot of history, as I keep trying to repeat, as if I'm trying to make it magically happen and be accepted. It's what allows the first island chain, the second island chain, which everybody talks about, is if you can magically transport there. It allows this corridor of freedom across the Pacific in order to be able to get to the bases in Japan and Korea, to the Philippines, and reach Taiwan. You don't have that zone, safe zone across the Pacific, being able to get across to the first and second island chain, which is very frequently mentioned without mentioning how to get there, becomes very difficult. Now that we know how important it is to the US, let's talk about how people who don't want the US to have such an important position react to that. So we know China's strategy of unrestricted warfare. We're talking about a zone where political warfare is dominant. We're not at kinetic here yet. It is a high priority area, obviously, for the Chinese, and let's see what that looks like. So in the context of unrestricted warfare, I would recommend the book by Carrie Gershanik, which you can download for free. This is taken out of that. Give us an idea of all of the different levers. I'm in Palau now. In Palau recognizes Taiwan. So it's a double threat to China. It's actually tripled threat because it's just the other side of the Philippines. So it recognizes Taiwan. It's highly strategically located, and it's in a free association with the U.S. And the U.S. is putting in installations here. There are close to 50 Marines on Peleliu that are in the process of rehabilitating the airfield and putting in a joint operations center. And they're putting in an over-the-horizon radar installation on Angar. The first phase for the Chinese, initial phase at least, is to try to get the country to de-recognize Taiwan so that they can put in a Chinese embassy. If you have a Chinese embassy, you have a forward operating location from which you can do, it's much easier to do the political warfare operations. So between 2010 and about 2015, Chinese pumped in a bunch of tourists. They went from kind of almost no tourists to over 100,000, well over 100,000 tourists a year in a country of 20,000 people, and became the dominant economic force in the country. Then they pulled all of the tourists and said, they're not coming back unless you de-recognize Taiwan. The Palauans said, no, thank you. We're going to stick with our good friends, Taiwan. And so then China started the second phase, which was pumping in transnational organized crime, including some very serious triad operatives, including Broken Tooth, who was operating out of Palau for a while. They've now entered the next phase, because then Palau set up a National Security Council, a National Security Coordinator who started kicking these sorts of people out of the country and really locking things down. The next phase, which is current, is the Chinese have now said, you've got a problem with Chinese organized crime. We can help you with that. So why don't you come here to Hong Kong so we can brief you and work with you to help you deal with your Chinese organized crime problem? To which the Palauans again said, no, thank you. But the Pacific Island Forum meeting is going to be coming up here end of August, beginning of September, and I expect it's going to be a bit contentious. So that's how this unrestricted warfare might work here. It was made explicit about how grand the plans were from China in 2022 when Wang Yi went through and talked and presented their vision and 5-year action plan for the region, which is a menu for functional colonization, getting cooperation in cyber, network governance, customs inspection, disaster management, prepositioning, putting in special envoys, training law enforcement, everything you would want to do if you're going to try to get control over key levers of the state. This was on the record. So if you go back to this map, which was the one we had before, which is a kinetic map, you've got the parts of the region that are US, parts that are the US freely associated states, parts that are the treaty allies. And you think if you look at the blue, it looks like China's fairly boxed in. But when Wang Yi went through the region in 2022, at the height of COVID, when all these countries had their borders closed, these are the countries that opened their border to Wang Yi, showing how first of all, they jumped the first and second island chain through political warfare, and they had enough leverage in these countries to get countries where people couldn't go home for their mother's funeral to let in a Chinese delegation. So the way that I think about it was this: if you're standing on the top of Mount Tapachao, which many Marines died to be able to secure, and you look out, you see the pre-positioning ships, the U.S. military pre-positioning ships offshore, pure kinetic warfare. They can fight a little war, very clever pieces of machinery. But you look onshore and you see a massive Chinese casino. And if I were trying to take over Saipan, I'd prefer the casino to the ships offshore. And that's the sort of thing that's happening all across the region. So the result is that if you look at countries that have signed up to the Belt and Road, started around 2014, you can see it's just swept through the region, including the Federated States of Micronesia, which is a U.S. freely associated state. If you look at countries that recognize Taiwan, you can see just how many have been lost. So it's working. They haven't won. They don't win unless you give up, but it's certainly working. And you can see it in the operations of countries. There was a series of letters put forward by President Panuelo from the Federated States of Micronesia, U.S. freely associated state, where he describes what it means to be in a country like this. And so he said, what does it really look like? This is from the president. When so much of our government senior officials and elected officials choose to advance their own personal interests in lieu of the national interest. After all, it's not a coincidence that a common thread behind the Chuk state succession movement and the Pohnpei Political Status Commission, to a lesser extent, Yap independence movement, include money from the PRC and whispers of PRC support. This is straight up disintegration warfare, very by the book Chinese sort of operation. And he's had direct threats against his personal safety as president of an independent country that the U.S. is sworn to defend. He also described this sort of incident where his country decided not to send a representative to the second China Pacific Island countries political dialogue. But the Chinese selected an FSM citizen and designated him to be representing FSM. So China, to sum it up, China established a precedent of taking our private citizens in multilateral meetings to formally represent our country without our government's awareness or approval thereof. This is complete bypassing of governance. So what's going on now? Well, what's interesting about the period we're in now is that there is President Trump is apparently very interested in McKinley, and there's a going back to some of the kind of that 19th century thinking about the area in a very overt way. And one of Secretary Hegseth's first trips after he became secretary was to Hawaii, Guam, Philippines, and Japan. So third, second, and first island chain. And you even have people like Steve Bannon talking about the three island chains, and the Pacific is really the American heartland. That's our defensive barrier. So it's becoming talked about in a way that it wasn't for a long time. And it's not just talk. Hegseth announced close to $2 billion in investment for the Federated States of Micronesia. That's mostly for a port and an airport. This is included, a chunk of it's included in the NDAA. This is money that's on the table. So I'm going to talk about what that looks like, because I just came from YAP. I was in YAP a couple days ago, and most of the money that he's talking about is going to be in YAP. So these are the 4 states of the Federated States of Micronesia. YAP is on the west side, so it's near to Palau. It is a highly strategic location. It has been for a long time. This is the YAP string of islands. YAP, it's the state of YAP, also has the main island called YAP proper. So during the German period, just to give you a sense of how strategic its location is, we talk now about fiber optic cables, but then it was, of course, telegraph cables. And YAP was the German telegraph hub, with lines laid up to Guam and down to the Philippines and up to Shanghai. This is known relevant strategic geography to the point where the U.S. in 21 wanted to make it explicit that that the U.S. wasn't giving up its rights. Ulithi is also in the state of YAP. Ulithi during World War II was the largest naval base. Towards the end of the war, there were over 600 ships in the lagoon at Ulithi at one time being fixed so that they could head back out again. What's going on in YAP? This is a letter that the former governor of YAP sent to President Biden in 2022, talking about Beijing creating a boxing ring in YAP and just pitting everybody against each other, talking about the internal bullying, the corruption, and also making this very important point that however, U.S. created welfare states in many of these islands by not demanding accountability and cessation of corruption. So by the U.S. training dependency, it created, in some cases, people who were just looking for bigger sugar daddies, right, in this context. And this is the governor of YAP at the time. This is a known and publicly discussed dynamic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Woolly Atoll. This is, again, the chain, the Yap Island chain. And the only way to get, until very recently, from Yap proper to Woolly or many of these other islands on the chain, was on this boat. this boat is a China aid donated cargo ship that seems to be designed for inland waterways, but is being used for open ocean transport. I took this boat. It takes about 4 nights to get from Yap proper to Wooley. You sleep on an open deck, and you have to bring all your own food and water. That's the only way to get down this island chain. Wooley itself was the site of a Japanese garrison of about 6,000, and they built this runway. It was one of the islands that was hopped over in the island hopping campaign. It was bombed, as you can see, but there was no landing. So about a third of the Japanese died of starvation and disease, with the commander sending a letter to his commander asking if they could please be sent to Peleliu where they could fight and die like men. They didn't. They stayed on the island and were surrendered. And if you go there, you still see the Japanese machinery all over the forest. I went there because I had heard that the Chinese were going to be rebuilding this Imperial Japanese runway. And there they were in the middle of the Yap island chain. And there I was with the Chinese when they were doing the groundbreaking on the Imperial Japanese runway. And you'll note no US government officials, no other observers of any kind, just a bunch of Chinese workers, a bunch of Micronesians, and a random Canadian, which gives you a sense of how much ground awareness there is, or unwillingness to spend 4 nights sleeping on the deck of a Chinese cargo ship. So where's the runway at now? That's the runway had to be fixed because that's what on the left. That's what had happened. The only plane that was flying in there regularly was a missionary airline that was doing medevacs, Pacific Mission Aviation, who are the best people on the planet. But they crashed on takeoff. And so they really needed a new runway because you get sick on Wooley, you have to wait for the boat, which can take 5 or 6 weeks. And then you've got 4 nights sleeping on the deck before you can get to a hospital. So there's the runway. Runway is now completed. It's got some issues with it. But the Chinese did it and nobody else did. There were a lot of problems with the construction, including when I got there, I took the photo on the left, the Chinese were dumping their raw sewage into the taro patch. And when they left behind things like the ship that sank and leaked oil into the lagoon. The locals would like to sue the Chinese, the Yap government, and the FSM government for letting the Chinese come in and do this. That's the sort of counter-Chinese political warfare support that would be very helpful across the region. We can get to it more in the Q&A if you like. That same Chinese state-owned company then moved on to do a bridge on Yap proper. This is the same island where the US is trying to put in $2 billion worth of infrastructure. Port here, airport here, bridge, Chinese ADB funded bridge in the middle of the two. And I just like this photo because when the Chinese, I think you could probably see here, originally put up the sign, they tried to claim it was a gift from China, and then ADB busted them and forced them to cover over the Chinese flag with the ADB insignia, which again is another little insight into how the Chinese are operating in the region. They want it to look like all of these things are gifts from China, even though they're funded by ADB or the national government or all sorts of other things. The political warfare is nonstop across the board. So what do we do about it? I think that what's required is a block and build strategy. You need to block what the Filipinos call China's illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive activity. I prefer that to gray zone, while at the same time as building up alternatives. And the U.S. is actually doing some very interesting things. In the case of Palau, at the end of December, a series of agreements were signed, which are consistent with the national security strategy, where the U.S. said it's going to send law enforcement advisors to Palau. I mentioned that the Chinese were deliberately flooding the region, Palau and others, with transnational organized crime, and cyber attacks, all sorts of stuff. And the U.S. said they're going to send a package of people. And I'm actually here because there's a meeting tomorrow about some of that. Costs about 2.2 million, but it's going to be way more effective on the political warfare front than the $1.4 billion runway that they're looking at doing in Yap. There's been President Whips of Palau was the keynote speaker at the Honolulu Defense Forum. There was a separate Honolulu Investment Summit to connect businesses in Pacific Island countries, which included companies like Google for the cables and all sorts of things. Like things are actually moving. There has also been some blocking. There was the designation of the president of Palau for taking money from the Chinese. But the problem is that this is kind of all very new, and so the follow-through hasn't been great. They designated the president of the Senate of Palau, but they didn't send a prosecution package to the AG of Palau. So you wounded this guy and then didn't put in place what was necessary to prosecute him. So he's turned it around to say the Americans are against me because I'm standing up for Palau sovereignty and they're just bullies. And this is actually a political warfare loss for the U.S. because it was half done. An interesting component of this block and build is that we're starting to see real step up from countries like Taiwan. The vice president of Taiwan left Palau today, and while she was here, she said that Taiwan is preparing to assign an investigation bureau person to Palau specifically to help with transnational organized crime and cybercrime. And this is something that Taiwan has done before and is very helpful with because they have the linguistic capabilities and the technical capabilities to help with decrypting some of the phones from the scam centers and things like that. So, almost made it to the end. So what's the goal? I think the goal is to protect the heartland in order to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open. It's the same thing from McKinley's. You need to make sure that you can refit on the other side and that the hostile powers can't get across and hit the Oregon and California coast, so to speak. Hasn't changed in 125 years. How do you do it? The problem that the U.S. has had, in part, is that it keeps thinking about the Pacific Islands, like they're all the same, and they're all strategically equally important or not important to the U.S. I'd argue that there are 3.5 different categories of how to look at it. The first is the U.S. territories, CNMI and Guam. The second is the freely associated states, Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands. And those two combined are the Central Pacific Heartland. Then you get to the other Pacific Island countries. And then layered on top of that are the 3 countries that recognize Taiwan, that are being attacked in a very specific way, and that you can combine together packages to defend. So there are different priorities, options, and partners depending on whether you're dealing with the territory. FBI can freely operate, so can Treasury, so can labor. U.S. freely associated states, a lot of those can. More federal governments, agencies can than you would think, not all of them. Other Pacific Island countries, they can't unless they're invited in for specific things. And then the ones that recognize Taiwan have a lot of maneuverability. So for over 150 years, America's leaders knew what happened in the Central Pacific doesn't stay in the Central Pacific, and China knows it as well now. And what are the stakes? In 2008, Admiral Keating told the Senate Armed Services Committee, a senior Chinese official suggested, as we develop our aircraft carriers, why don't we reach an agreement, you and I? You take Hawaii East, we'll take Hawaii West, we'll share information, and we'll save you all the trouble of deploying your Navy west of Hawaii. This is exactly back to what the concern was around the Pacific close to 200 years ago. And China is building the capability kinetically to be able to do it, but it's already very far advanced in being able to do it from a political warfare perspective. And with that, I say thank you in the language of some of the westernmost Americans in Guam, but I won't massacre the Chamorro. I will just leave it there. Thank you.